Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last day of August. I cannot believe this is the last day of August, but here we are today, and the title of the session is Acknowledging LGBTQIA+. And we have with us our presenter, Vanessa Kitsi. She studies information practices of marginalized groups with a focus on LGBTQ plus and people and communities. Her research findings inform how information centers, such as libraries and systems, can better serve these individuals. Her work is interdisciplinary, spanning library and information science, communication, sociology, and other and critical studies. So that's her in a nutshell. If there's more that she wants us to know about her, she will tell us. But at this time, welcome, Vanessa.
Yeah.
We'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming today, and thanks to the CTE for having me. My name's Vanessa. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information Science. So you might be thinking, like, information science, what does that have to do with this topic? Why isn't she from WGST? What's going on? So my research really looks at what we call the social question of information science, which is how do people relate to, seek, create, share, and make meaning out of information in their everyday lives. What most of my focus really looks at is that within health contexts for LGBTQIA+ folks. So current research that I look at has been examining what is called the health information practices of LGBTQIA+ people and communities within South Carolina. So in other words, how do folks create, seek, share, and use health information in order to promote their own health and then support health promotion for those in their communities? I look at how information centers like libraries could potentially be supporting people and communities in the work that they're already doing. And then another project that I have is specifically looking at this from the standpoint of community health work. So identifying and training LGBTQIA+ community leaders within the state to become community health workers, pairing them with academic librarians, and having them co-create an information resource for the CHW's community. So again, information science, people generally tend to think of us like libraries. I'm often asked if I like working at Thomas Cooper. I don't work there. I teach and research out of Davis College, which is across the street. But because we are an interdisciplinary program, I have several interests that are outside of the boundaries of just librarianship, including LGBTQIA+ identities and issues. So what is this kind of presentation today going to be all about? What I like to start off with is an introduction that kind of goes over the scope, because I think that sometimes people come into this expecting it to go over certain information that it doesn't. So I want to make sure to manage our expectations very early on in the presentations. After that, I want to talk about two concepts that are really going to be important to informing the lens by which I'm approaching this presentation, which is queerness and pedagogy. So we'll go over those. And then I'm going to take you through 4 different queer pedagogical practices that you can employ in your teaching. And then we'll talk about some of the limits of those practices and kind of issues that might emerge that we need to consider when using them. And then finally, I have a conclusion that's not really formed. I was just kind of thinking about it yesterday, and I was like, this is an additional consideration I just want us to think about. So we'll just talk about that, stuff that's on my mind late at night. And then from there, I'll have time for questions. So first thing, if you haven't already noticed, even though this title is Acknowledging LGBTQIA+ Visibility in the Classroom, I will be using the term queer a bunch. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to acknowledge that this is a complex term and it doesn't have universal appeal or applicability. In fact, from a historical standpoint, queer has often been thought of and used as a pejorative term. And I'm certainly not using this word to insinuate in any sort of way that all LGBTQIA+ people identify with this term or feel comfortable being referred to using this term. So today, I'm not really using the term queer to signify identity as much as I'm using it to signify somebody's social and structural position within a society. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I want to kind of unpack what this term might mean, but just to let you know, you're going to hear a lot of it today. So let's start by talking about some of the things that this presentation is not going to be about. So the first thing is that the goal of this presentation is not solely about helping queer students navigate challenges within the educational system. And the reason why it's not about this is because that sort of goal kind of assumes that queer students need to in some way change their behavior rather than looking inward to think about what's flawed with the system that's making this call for them to change their behavior in the first place. Second thing, it is not about fostering queer inclusion, because what this often assumes is that homophobia and transphobia comes from a place of ignorance. And if we, for example, just put some queer scholars on our syllabus or think about different queer issues in our classes, that's going to eradicate that sort of a problem because you're teaching people. There are plenty of people who are homophobic and transphobic, and they know plenty about queer lives and queer experiences, right? So we're not necessarily calling for just queer inclusion. Similarly, this presentation is not about fostering tolerance of queer people, because what tolerance signifies is really telling queer students that it's okay to be you. And by saying it's okay to be you to somebody, essentially what you're not saying is that there's something wrong, right, with that sort of identity. And so by using that language, we're kind of making that insinuation. The other thing is that it's sometimes not okay to be queer in certain situations, right? So I look at health information practices. Coupled with those practices are all of the health challenges that queer people face on a daily basis, right? And so there are situations where you're exposed to physical violence where it is decidedly not okay to be a queer person. Now, I don't mean to say that these strategies are not all positive or can't have positive consequences, right? I'm not going to try to tell you don't put queer scholars in your syllabus because that's a limited practice. But what I want to say is that while they're needed, they're limited, right? And there are some implications that might be unintended that are going to happen if we just focus on these things. So for this presentation, I want to move beyond just focusing on these 3 points. That being said, I don't want to leave you completely adrift. If you came in here and you were like, I'm really thinking that this is going to be a time where we talk about like on-campus resources for queer students and things of that nature. So as part of my community health worker project, I actually worked with community health workers who are also LGBTQ leaders within the state. And we developed basically a list of resources. That includes visible queer organizations within the state of South Carolina. That includes like affirming medical practitioners, needs assessments, all information like that. Excerpts of that resource guide are going to be available to you and emailed to you after this presentation so that you have them. And of course, I can't not mention the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs and all of the wonderful programming that they have centered around queer student experiences, specifically their Safe Zone trainings. So if you haven't taken one of those, please sign up for one. And then also they have trans advocacy workshops as well. So after you take a Safe Zone training, you can then take the trans advocacy workshop. So those resources are also available to you. Okay, but I did a lot of like what the presentation isn't about. So let's get into what we're actually talking about today. So the first thing is that we're going to work on building praxis. So in other words, we're thinking about how the ways in which we approach our teaching then are going to inform adjustments that we make over time that centers on difference. So I'm going to be talking a lot about queer pedagogy and queer pedagogical principles. And so what we'll talk about in this presentation is what is that and how do we leverage it amongst ourselves and our students to understand multiple forms of knowledge and ignorance that are operating within a classroom. Second thing, This workshop is about encouraging us to question the stories that we tell ourselves about knowledge. So, if you are within education, you have probably heard about the banking model of education before. So this idea that when we are teaching in a classroom, we're just filling our students' heads with knowledge, right, that we're providing to them. So it casts the student as having some sort of like deficit that we as experts are filling as instructors. We're not going to think about knowledge in this sort of way within this presentation. Instead, we're going to think about knowledge as something that we co-construct with our students, that they're active participants in. And then finally, and most important, one day I'm going to write like a paper on how much I hate best practices, but for now I like to say it a lot. So I'm not going to give you solutions to things that you should be doing in your classroom or issues that emerge, because those are highly contextual. They're going to depend on the relationship with the specific students who you have in your classes at any one point in time and the topics that you're covering. So I can't really provide you with best practices. And actually, queer theory, which also informs the way in which I approach this presentation, would say that really there's no such thing as best practices, because that kind of focuses on measures of success, which doesn't exist as far as that field is concerned. So this is all about providing you with some examples, some things that you could consider doing, but not saying these are the things that you must do in your classroom. Okay, let's do a little activity. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to just take a few minutes and think about what the term queer means and just write down a definition. So do that now. So I see most folks are done writing, and for those of you who are continuing to write, feel free to do that. But let me get a read of the room. What are some of the things that we wrote when we're thinking about what the term queer means? Yeah?
I put people existing outside the social norms regarding gender and relationships.
Love it. What did other people put? People existing outside of the norms of traditional genders and relationships. Anything additional or different that folks are down? Yeah.
Kind of in addition to that, ways of being in the world that unsettles normative standards.
Yep, so I love that word, that unsettles. So one, we're thinking in terms of like a position, right? So I was saying before how I, at least within this presentation, kind of using queer as more of a subject position. But then also now we're thinking about something a little bit more active, like actively trying to unsettle. Yeah.
So it's also, I would add, it's, at least in my understanding, it's broader in terms of it's a non-white construct of the whatever they're echoing them, but that so it's broader and it moves away from the image of somebody looks this way because that's what we're used to.
Yeah, so again, disrupting what's often taken for granted, what's often visible, and what's often taken to be like normal or legitimate within a society. Not necessarily just dealing also with gender identity or sexuality. Yes. Excellent. So just really building on those, what you probably, the first thing you probably got out of that is that there's not really a standard or like stable definition for queerness or queer. But we could kind of think about queerness as operating under like three broadly accepted and utilized sorts of meanings. So there's queer as a subject position. And so this is specifically the way that I am kind of deploying it as a term. And so essentially here, we're thinking about queerness as any sort of exclusion that people are experiencing. And I did put with genders and sexualities outside of cis and heteronormative frameworks. So cis and heteronormative, just taking it for granted that everyone is cisgender, taking it for granted that everybody is heterosexual, right? We have a lot of different practices and just social assumptions that reinforce this on a daily basis. But also, to your point, queerness operates also outside of just looking at genders and sexualities as well. And one of the critiques of certain applications of queerness is that it often centers whiteness, right? And even when we cite queer theorists, we tend to focus on like Foucault, right? Like the white guys, yeah. And then another way that we could think about it is also queer as a politic. And so this is specifically that like active deployment of queerness that you were talking about, where it's this idea that specifically you are queer and you are acting on that in a way that's challenging the status quo, right? Pushing back against norms. And this kind of gets back to that point that not all LGBTQIA plus people or organizations or institutions are queer. So I'll just give you an example. Human Rights Campaign, right? A lot of how the HRC operates is through their like pushing of what are like kind of like assimilation-based narratives. So this idea that like, oh, we're LGBTQ, we're just like you, right? We only have this one point of difference, but otherwise, to be accepted in a society, we just have this one point of difference, but otherwise we're all the same. That's why often HRC attaches itself to very like normative projects like marriage equality, right? Or allowing LGBTQ people to serve in the military. Queer as an aesthetic sensibility. So these are where my guys come in, right? So basically, this is the act of seeking out subversive content in different texts. And these are, media texts in general. So one example would be reading Bert and Ernie as being lovers, right? As opposed to just best buddies on Sesame Street. So that would be an example of queerness as an aesthetic sensibility. And so all of these different types of queerness function when we engage in queer pedagogy. So that's where I want to go, not quite next, but in a second. So this concept of queer, the way that we frame it, often comes from queer theory. Again, not really a standard or stable definition for what queer theory is, but if I had to summarize it, it's examining how the labels that we use, particularly those, but not exclusively those, related to gender and sexuality, are shaped by ideologies that control what we do by minimizing our sense of self. So in other words, being constrained based on societal expectations, based on what you are read as, right? And so we can take those definitions of queer from the last slide and actually match them to 3 definitions of queer theory. We could think here of as queer as a noun, so the study of queer people. It's kind of similar to like music theory, right? Like, so the study of something. We could think of queer as an adjective. And so this is like a weird or a strange theory, right? A theory that deviates from how other theories are structured. So we're always questioning how knowledge is generated, what are the dominant forms of generating knowledge, and how might we change those? Queer as a verb. So this is where you're actually acting on theory. You're acting on these dominant ways of obtaining knowledge and like literally queering it. So thinking about how might these outcomes look different. So I promise this is the last time I'm going to have you do this cheesy write down a definition. I've been torturing my undergrads with this. But now I want you to think about queer plus the word pedagogy. So just take a few minutes and think about what might queer pedagogy mean. So what do we got? What are thoughts on what queer pedagogy might mean? Go for it, and then if anybody else wants to add, they'll take a grab.
So I was thinking of it as ways of teaching and learning that through centering of difference expand our horizons of what knowledge and education can be.
I love that. So thinking about centering difference, right, in order to expand our notions of knowledge and education and what that could be. Anything else to add from folks that they wrote down? Yeah.
I wrote difference from mainstream colonized forms of knowledge making.
Love that. Yes. And then you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I wrote challenging ways or methods of teaching that reinforce or reaffirm normativities And I think this is not just gender and sexualities, but also ways of learning styles. So we often assume through lectures, students of course should learn. I said it, why don't you know, right? So kind of questioning and reflecting on how we teach, the limitations of different teaching styles and learning styles, and but with the potential to change for the better, right? Politics, as you mentioned.
I love this, with the potential, right, to change for the better. And again, next time this session comes, if anybody else wants to teach it, please go for it, because you pretty much hit, right, what's on this slide. So I think a couple of important things that you all hit at, not just with this definition, but also when thinking about queer as a concept. You might notice that all of a sudden we don't see gender and sexuality on the slide at all, right? So thinking about queerness as being broader than that, and queer pedagogy as being broader than that. So when we're thinking about queer pedagogy, it's a radical form of educative praxis implemented deliberately to interfere with, to intervene in the production of normalcy in school subjects. So gets to your definition, right? Like questioning these taken for granted practices that we often employ in the classroom, and just things that we kind of do on a daily basis without really thinking about it when we're instructing. Probably some of the things that I'm even doing now, right? And the assumptions that I'm making. The key aim here is not the transmission of ready-made knowledge. So in other words, not that banking model of education where we're saying, I know something that you don't, and I'm going to fill your heads with it, right? It's rather the creation of a new condition of knowledge, the creation of an original learning disposition. So you're actually getting your students to question things that we often take for granted, not just within the classroom in regard to our teaching practices, but also issues outside of the classroom that we can fold into it. So the last thing that I'll kind of like hit on here is, again, not really the presence of the words like sexuality or gender. And that's because with queer pedagogy, I liken it to like curb cuts. So curb cuts, right, and a sidewalk, originally designed for people with wheelchairs and with walkers to help with their mobility, right, to cross the street. Other groups of people also benefit from those curb cuts. I like to run. Super convenient for me not to have to give a little hop, right, when I go over the sidewalk. If you have like a stroller and you're pushing it, right, that's going to be helpful, a shopping cart, things of that nature as well. And so what I like to think of when I think about queer pedagogy is that even though we're not necessarily always going to be centering gender and sexuality, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are not benefiting all of these other groups of people as well, who are often placed in different ways structurally at the margins of society because they're not, for whatever reason, taken for granted to be what's normal or what's visible. Queer pedagogy, as well as being like super broad, can't be condensed to a set of like instructional techniques. It's more of like just a way of rethinking about your instruction. And so what I want to do next is think about 4 different areas of queer pedagogy, and then just give you some examples of how you might be able to reorient thinking in a way that can then apply those principles within your classroom. So in other words, I'll give you some examples, but they're definitely not best practices, right? So the first one is queer pedagogy as the study of limits. And so again, lots of the excellent definitions that were provided for what is queer pedagogy focused on the limits of traditional systems of knowledge production and consumption, right? So what we are doing when we are thinking about queer pedagogy as the study of limits is examining the unmarked criteria to dismiss as irrelevant or valorize as relevant a particular mode of thought, field of study, or insistence upon the real. So what does this mean in English? Well, essentially, when planning or developing a class, instead of asking what information do I want to convey to my students, so what information do I as an expert want to like dump into their minds, we should ask instead, what questions shall we ask of each other? After we explore those questions, what will have been left out? And then what other questions should we ask of each other? So one of the important things about queer pedagogy in your classroom practices is that it's dialogic. It's not just you dumping what it is that you think that you know into your students' heads who you view as lacking that knowledge, right? It's about having constant construction and conversation about the limits of what we think we're traditionally teaching and why those limits might exist. So just a couple of examples, because again, it sounds like very high level, but how do you actually achieve queer pedagogy as the study of limits within a classroom? So one of the ways is to include information on who or what was left out when a specific body of knowledge or fact was developed. Now, I think this has applicability to any subject that you're teaching. And so I'm going to try to go out of information science with my examples just so that I could show you that these have applicability to any subject that you're teaching. So before living here, I lived in Brooklyn for a couple of years, and I was fortunate enough to live right by the Brooklyn Museum. So I used to go to the Brooklyn Museum all of the time. And there was this really, really cool exhibit. It's still there. So if you're ever in Brooklyn, you should check it out. It's called A Woman's Afterlife, Gender Transformation in Ancient Egypt. And so I know nothing about Egyptology, so if I'm getting anything wrong and somebody's more of an expert, please correct me. But my cursory understanding from just being a neighbor and museum lover of this exhibit is that traditionally, what was believed by archaeologists and historians related to the mummification process for Egyptian people was that you could only access the afterlife if you were a man. And the way that your coffin was prepared was very intentional to signify that you were a man, so that you could have no problems, going into the afterlife, right? You weren't sent to purgatory. I don't know if that's a thing in Egyptian religion, but you got to the afterlife pretty easily. And so what they did was they actually took like an Egyptian character that translates roughly, I guess in English, to the word you, and they would put that on the coffin. Don't ask me why, but that's just one of the things that they did. And another thing that they did was they painted a picture of the person who had died in red. And so those were two markers that they would put on every coffin for men who had died in order to make sure that they had a successful passage to the afterlife. So archaeologists started to uncover certain instances in which they would see coffins with the painting and the character, but it was actually a woman who was mummified inside. And originally, what they concluded is that those were just mistakes, right? Those are just mistakes. But then you had these archaeologists who also studied feminism who came in, and they started looking at those same coffins. And they were like, no, that's actually not what's going on here. What's going on here is that people were trying to get women, or some women, into the afterlife as well by transforming them into men when they mummified them so that they could have passage to the afterlife, and then they would transform back into women. So a lot of gender fluidity going on in Egypt, right? And this is something that, again, wasn't necessarily discovered, not because it didn't exist, but because who got to uncover what facts and how they frame those facts, right? So that is something that when we're thinking about queer pedagogy as the study of limits, we could talk about in a class. Think about traditional ways that facts are uncovered within whatever your discipline is, and what are the limitations to that sort of discovery. Another example, asking students how the world may be different if we approached knowledge from whatever our discipline is and how we get knowledge, right? Because it's going to vary, using alternate strategies. So this one, close cousin of information science, but computer science, right? Code's often written using binary logic. What does it look like if we don't write code using binary logic? That could be a question that you ask your students. There's a whole thing on queer coding. That's another thing. If you ever are looking for examples of queering any sort of discipline or topic, just put the word queer before it and look for examples, and you're likely to find them, right? But there's a whole subfield of queer coding studies that talks all about this. So that's also a way to find content if you don't know of counterexamples off the top of your head. Another example here. So if you were, in a pharmacology class, you might ask, what might clinical trials look like if we didn't group people into gender binaries? How does that change medicine, right? So again, thinking about traditionally, how does your discipline uncover knowledge? And then what are the limitations, potential limitations of uncovering knowledge in that sort of a way. So listen, if we have time, we can come back and do these as activities, but I generally tend to like drone on and get to the point where time has already expired. So I'm putting them as reflection questions for now, but just things to think about. So one exercise that you might do, taking that queer pedagogy as a study of limits sort of way of thinking, is think about your course syllabi. So in what ways might your syllabi reinforce taken for granted norms or ideas of normalcy? And I put around gender and sexuality just to give you a starting point, but you could certainly drop that off and just think about ideas of normalcy more broadly. And then what are some approaches that you could adopt to queer your syllabus using what we just discussed? So one thing that always comes to like the top of my mind when thinking about this exercise is I think across all of our fields, the production of knowledge is often very gatekept, right? Behind like paywalls for academic journals, we tend to assign those sorts of things to our students, and we say that this is the legit stuff that you got to read for the class. But think about all the other forms of knowledge that exist in gray literature, for instance, that you could potentially pull and integrate into a syllabus. So using things that are traditionally labeled as non-authoritative within your syllabi would be one example there. Okay, so another focus of queer pedagogy is queer pedagogy as the study of ignorance. So we want to shift how we think about ignorance as like some sort of limitation to be overcome into like more of a constructive sort of tool. And so really, this offers a queer perspective on ignorance in and of itself because it doesn't necessarily assume that ignorance comes from a lack of knowing something. So for instance, you might think that someone who doesn't believe that climate change is real is ignorant. In general, that's not going to be the case, right? They're going to know a lot about climate change denialism. They're going to give you all of these sources and this information as to where they did their research and how they engaged in critical thinking in order to come up to that conclusion. Believe me, I teach a news literacy class. We talk about all conspiracy theories and how people who believe in them aren't dumb, right? They're engaging in a lot of like very critical literacy skills in order to arrive at the conclusions that they're drawing, but they have a completely different worldview and way of attaining knowledge. And so that's what we have to understand when we find ignorance in the classroom is what does that say about what our students believe and where they're coming from and how they develop knowledge. So some suggestions for practice here are to have students think or reflect on an instance where they thought about volunteering information in class but ultimately decided not to. So what was it about the information that made the student want to exclude it from the conversation? And as you can see, too, these areas kind of relate to one another because this could also be limits in the classroom. What's appropriate to be shared? What's appropriate to be asked? If anybody has good ideas for this, by the way, and how you could implement this one in the classroom, let me know, because I think one of the things about this sort of an activity is that you probably wouldn't want to share it with your professor, right? I often will ask students, for instance, like, what did you disagree with about an article that you read? And they're never that comfortable with sharing that sort of disagreement with me. And I think that that's kind of the setup of an instructional space where you are the authority and you're assigning articles that are authoritative. So I think building out that environment takes a lot of work, but it's something that's worth thinking about and exploring. The other thing is to mirror, and this is something that we could do, right? And this is something that might encourage our students to be more open to sharing, is to think about what information you have excluded from a class and why you chose to exclude it, and sharing that with students. So I've actually done this in two different ways. One way is that like when I teach news literacy, especially, I really try to not position it like I know more than them in terms of how to like critically assess messages, because I'm fooled all of the time. And so I like to bring up examples of where I've just truly been fooled by mis or disinformation, just because that's something I think that goes against traditional forms of knowledge, because we want to kind of portray ourselves as the experts in certain topics, so we don't want to admit when we've gotten it wrong, right? But I think even just correcting yourself sometimes to your students could potentially get them feeling more comfortable to engage in that first point. The other thing is that actually with this presentation, when I was first developing it, another sort of tenet of queer pedagogy is all about the connection between education, sexuality, and pleasure. I don't want to go in that direction for this presentation. And that says something larger about like the current socio-political moment that we're in. And this idea that I was a little afraid that I didn't want to necessarily talk about those connections, lest people leave with the thought that like I was over-sexualizing everything related to queerness. So again, what do we choose to teach in our classes, and what do we choose to leave out? So a reflection question that you could ask yourself, or a series of questions related to that, is how might our forms of assessment change when adopting queer pedagogical principles that connect knowledge to ignorance? So what assumptions do these changes overturn? So actually, going back to this example, because now I'm just brainstorming with myself, but thinking about students reflecting on an instance where they thought about volunteering information but ultimately decided not to, that's not necessarily going to be an assignment that they're going to be comfortable turning in. Do you feel comfortable giving them that without them turning it in and giving them credit for doing it? Right? That could be a way that you change traditional assessment criteria. Okay. Queer pedagogy as the study of reading practices. So this is really, I said before that this presentation wasn't just about integrating queer identities, experiences, and voices into your teaching materials, but of course that is important, and certainly intersectional perspectives as well, right? So here you're thinking about incorporating texts about and from the perspectives of queer people, and also reading queerly. So it doesn't just mean, much like if you take a decolonializing your syllabus session, decolonializing your syllabus is not just citing BIPOC people in the syllabus, right? You're not going to solve the problem of a colonialized syllabus just by citing BIPOC people. It's the same thing, right, with this. So we want to integrate it, but we don't necessarily just want to exclusively focus on this one bullet. And that's where I think the reading queerly comes in, because any text that you assign can be read queerly, regardless of who authored it. So first suggestion for practice is, of course, assigning texts written by queer authors and or focusing on queer experiences. As I said before, one suggestion here is to actually look at gray literature, things like websites and blogs of people who might not have access to formal modes of publishing, but are experts on these topics. Just as an example here, I'm teaching a class that's called Social Informatics, which makes sense to no one but me, because it's the name of the field, and people are like, what the heck is that? It's essentially like a sociology of technology course. And so one of the things, one of the readings that I give them in this class is actually from this book called Design Justice by Sasha Constanza Chalk. And so Sasha Constanza Chalk is a non-binary trans femme person, and they write about their experiences with TSA and going through specifically that like millimeter scanner that you go through, you know, when you go to the airport. And they talk about all of the social and technical components that kind of combine together to label them as not normal when they go through that scanner and their body does not conform to what the scanner is looking for. Right? So there's this like logic of binary gender that's actually designed into the technology. And there's also the practices that happen after this. So the TSA agent that comes over, right, and subjects you to all this additional scrutiny. And so having my students actually read this kind of like first-person perspective that was originally not even in a book, it was just published online on their website, is something that I think helps them think about technology from a less dominant perspective than what they're typically used to reading about. Second thing in reading queerly is to can't talk today, interrogate students and your own readings of text and how you are interpreting things. So here you can ask questions like, why did I understand it to mean that and not something else? What meanings did I want to find and what meanings did I manage to avoid finding? How does my reading preserve normalcy for the speaker's race, gender, and or sexual identity or for my own? How else could one read it and what else could it mean? So kind of piggybacking on that example of reading about the experiences of going through the airport scanner, what I'll have students do as like a warm-up activity for discussion is to think about their own positionalities and how those influence their relationships with technologies. So for instance, for me, I don't have a second thought when I go to the airport and I go through security. Doesn't worry me. I have a very smooth experience. What are some reasons why? Right? So thinking about students and their experiences going through and how that might impact them in ways that go beyond, right, gender and sexuality. So I had one of my students come to the class, this like killed me, because he wore this shirt from his family reunion. And so he was like, I wore this shirt today because it reminded me of this experience that we read about going through the scanner. And he said, you know, I was on my way to my family reunion. I went through the scanner, it was detected, and they came over and like subjected me to like 20 minutes of questioning, and I'm pretty sure it was because I was a black man going through, right, the scanner. So again, when we're talking about queering, we're not just talking about gender and sexuality, right? We're talking about other identities as well. It's a curb cut thing. All right. So reflection questions here. Think about how you could potentially rework an in-class activity you offer using queer pedagogy as a study of reading practices, and what would you need to change or why? So if you have a class, for instance, where you're assigning students a reading, and you're having them like interpret that reading, how might you rework that activity? So you're having them also think about their own positionalities and how those might be impacted through the implications of what it is that you're reading in the class. Okay. Last one. Queer pedagogy is the study of disclosure. This is interesting because sometimes I say the word disclosure to people, like identity disclosure, and people will be like, well, why don't you just say coming out? I don't really like coming out, so that's why I don't use it. But you can think about disclosure, or if coming out is more comfortable, that as well. But this is really not just for people who identify as queer or queerly, right, or who have subject positions that are queer. And again, I think about this, I say sexualities and gender identities, but outside of that as well. So carefully considering whether, how, and under what conditions it might be productive to disclose identities and experiences. Now, in some cases, you don't really have a choice, right? It also depends on how your students read you. In other situations, you might just, for social reasons, want to share stuff about yourself. So what's important here is that I'm speaking about carefully considering disclosure in the classroom, not from the perspective of like, oh, if you're a queer person, you should really think about like what you share about yourself in a class, because that onus of that responsibility should come on you because you have a queer identity. Whereas like another professor who's not queer could, for instance, talk about, you know, their husband or their wife with no sorts of like repercussions. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you want to engage in disclosure as a queer pedagogical practice, these are some of the considerations that you might want to employ. If you just want to share stuff about your life, right, that signifies your queerness to students, absolutely, right? Like that's totally something that if it's safe and comfortable for you to do so, you should do. But if you're trying to engage in disclosure as a pedagogical practice, here are some considerations. So the first is to just consider the intent behind the disclosure if you are doing it for a pedagogical purpose. Again, if you're doing it for a social purpose, just to share or connect with your students, totally different thing. If you're thinking about this from like a pedagogical perspective, here are just some considerations to keep in mind. So one is that sometimes when disclosing your identity, what could potentially happen is that students might think that those identities are stable or that you're a stand-in, right, for that one identity. And so it could cause them to kind of think about your identity as monolithic. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, because originally when I was actually asked to do this presentation, it was like, it framed to me as like, can you talk to people about pronouns for an hour and 25 minutes? And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So this is the part where we can talk a little bit about pronouns, and I could explain why I don't want to talk about pronouns for an hour and 25 minutes, which is that you don't want to assume that your students wish to disclose their sexualities and gender identities and other elements of their identities that might be queer. So I think we're often told, and I even think there's like template syllabus language that I really don't like. That's essentially just like, when you go into a classroom, you should either A, make it mandatory that all the students share their pronouns, or B, we're not going to share pronouns, but if I misgender you, just come to me and tell me that I did that, right? Because that's putting the onus on the student. That's saying that there's something wrong, like that you have to change your behavior to fix, as opposed to my practice. So what I do with the pronouns thing is I try to have students feel like they can be visible and welcome in my class. And also, it's just a social signaling sort of thing, right? It's a little bit performative. Especially for me, because I'll be like, I'm Vanessa, she, her, hers, right? But I do it. And the reason why I do it is just to let students know that that's okay if they want to share. And generally on the first day of class, what I'll do is I'll say, we're going to have an activity. If you feel comfortable, go ahead and share your pronouns. If this is something that you don't want to share in front of everybody else, you can come to me at the end of class, right? And we can have a conversation about that. And that's kind of how I do it. And I kind of make it like almost like a throwaway comment, so that it leaves students a window that's open if they do want to share, because for some students it's really important and they do want to share, right, with the class. But then you better be ready as an instructor to correct them if people misgender, right, after somebody shared their pronouns. And then the other thing is that it also gives them the opportunity to, if they don't feel comfortable sharing their pronouns in front of everybody else, because some people don't, they could come to you at the end of class and share that with you as well. Because some students want you to use different pronouns when you're referring to them on a one-to-one basis versus in a classroom setting. I used to do this like, almost like little Google form where I'd ask like, give me a fun fact about yourself, and I'd put in stuff about pronouns too. And there you can ask other contextual things like, under what situations would you want me to use these pronouns? What if I'm talking to somebody else from the faculty about you? What pronoun should I be using? How about with other students? Yeah.
What is the current, so I mean, I guess for disclosure, I'm heteronormative, right? I've worked on projects, I teach in business, and business is traditionally far more conservative.
Yeah.
And I've gone back and forth with, please let me know your pronouns if you wish. I don't do my pronouns, just today someone was like, dear sir, right? And to me, I don't really care.
Yeah.
There's other reasons for why, if you think I'm a man, fine, right?
Yeah.
In business. So, but what is the status of using ally? Because isn't that like a problem now, or for some ways, like how do you signal, like I want to consider all of this, right, if ally becomes offensive or sends the wrong message, then what do you use?
Yeah, so,
right?
And definitely I'm not the expert on, but like what I've heard in general dialogue is that there's a shift often from like allyship to being like an accomplice instead. And so this idea that like allyship can sometimes be like virtue signally or like performative, whereas like being an accomplice, you're very much working behind the scenes. And so I think like one of the ways that you could kind of subversively work behind the scenes, and I'm just thinking about this because you said that you're from the business school, is,
Not here.
oh,
I worked in USC, but I actually teach for Aiken.
oh,
I've
gotcha.
taught in a number of business schools. And there's a mix, right? So I've taught where students were told never to disclose
Yeah.
anything, and then things moved and to where I had students in the classroom that were, whatever, were very open when,
Yeah.
right? And so there's certainly a mix. I think here, I'm new to the South, so I don't, queer is really a Southern term, right?
Yeah.
But I don't find, I mean, it's different too because it's online a lot. But,
Yeah.
But I do think about, I guess that's why I came. How do we? Students have always approached me and felt that they could talk about things, right? But that's different in the syllabus and in the online setting. Short of like writing a statement, I don't know what's appropriate.
So I do have a syllabus statement about not just pronouns, but what I do say about pronouns is that, like, number one, it's my expectation that you're going to refer to people in the class, right, using their pronouns. I don't like to say preferred because it's not a preference, right? Like using their pronouns. And then I give them resources. So I say, like, here's like it's called, I think, like pronoun dressing room, where you can practice, right, with different pronouns. And then I give them information on why are pronouns important in the syllabus. I also actually give them a link that says, this is why I'm not requiring you to state what your pronouns are, so that they have that background information too. And then I say to students, like, it's my expectation that you'll refer to others. And then also, if you don't know someone's pronouns, right, like best practice is to refer to them using their first name. So I have that, right, in the syllabus as well. But for me, just in the classroom, because I don't want to put people on the spot, especially if they don't feel comfortable, but at the same time, I want to keep the door open for people who do want to share, is I'll share mine because I feel very comfortable doing that. But again, it goes back to study of disclosure, right? So I'm using that for a pedagogical purpose, and that's something that just for me is very easy and like safe to do, right? But then what I do is I just say, if you'd like to share. And generally a lot of students who, haven't really given it much thought are not going to share it because they just assume, oh, I'm going to be read as, right, my pronouns. But other students, it does open the door if they do want to share. And I've found, like, with those forms, even though I think they're good in the larger lecture classes, they're also like stuff where you can like get some hate in there because some people will come up with hateful answers, which is why I've also stopped doing that. Yeah. So that's why I've stopped.
No, I do that. Give me a fun fact, but I do monitor language. So I will speak about my husband, but sort of say, if your partner or that type of thing, where it's like, whatever you want to tell me. But again, it's, sometimes we don't, sometimes like words, or the other example is I don't like the term Latinx, right? I am Latin American. I strongly object to that word. And I'll say it to my students, right? But that's not to say that I object to somebody else identifying as Latinx if that's what they need to do.
Sure.
Right? So it's sort of those conversations that you can't. They're hard to navigate.
They're super hard to navigate, and that's why I don't have best practices, because it's also going to depend on the context of your class. But some of the things that you've said that I think have probably, just from your examples, opened it up so that students do feel comfortable talking to you, are some of the things that you've said that you've done with how you word stuff, and then also what you share about certain labels and things of like, I personally wouldn't use this, but I'm okay with other people using this. And because people can pick that up, and even if they don't necessarily have that identity, but they have another identity that's kind of positioned as queer within a society, they're gonna read that as like, okay, this person also has potential openness to me. And I think it's also, when I was kind of saying about like being subversive or going under the surface sometimes when you don't feel comfortable sharing certain stuff, I think just providing support behind the scenes, because like word of mouth is a big thing, right? And that gets out. So I know, for instance, here, or what I've at least found out, and this is a broad generalization based on talking to a few students. But from what I've heard about the climate with like honors college thesis writers here is that students feel like they can't find professors who are willing to work with them when they want to do their honors college thesis on an LGBT topic. Yeah, and so it's one of the things where now the folks at OMSA will actually forward me because I've told them I don't care what their area is, like I'll make it work with to supervise them. You know what I mean? And so that would be like an example of a way that you can kind of be under the radar with stuff, but word gets around, right, that you're doing this stuff. And it seems to me that you're doing these sorts of practices already because students have that comfort with you.
In the past, especially face-to-face and plus I have friends, right?
Yeah.
And we all have different groups, I guess, identities.
Yeah, and I think that that's important as much as too, like if you're kind of tweaking your teaching methods to kind of embrace queer pedagogy, that also means that your students who are positioned as queer, again, pick up on that sort of stuff. Another thing with pronouns and stuff, so one of the things that's a barrier here and at other institutions too with using Blackboard is that in Blackboard you can have a preferred name, but then you have a legal name that's listed in your Blackboard. And so sometimes you're not going to see the student's preferred name, you're just going to see their legal name. So I never call people by their first name on the photo roster because I don't actually know that that's the name that they go by. So that's where also, if I have a manageable class, I'll have them introduce themselves by the name that they go by, as opposed to taking roll call, right, and naming everybody, because that can cause unwanted visibility as well. And then, I mean, really, like, this last part goes to some of the examples that you were just talking through, which is just like kind of monitoring the language that you use. Yeah. Yeah.
From the pronouns. So depending on who's talking about it, it sometimes feels the same way as, like we said, we should not tell students how they should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing. Like my language, my first language has no gender in it. So I am being told to identify genders, and if I would say, and I'm saying it not from a teaching perspective in general, if I would say to a man, and if I would refer to a man that identifies as a man with she, there's like, oh, that's fine, you made a mistake in English. If I say to someone who identifies as, like, I should call them they, them, and I call them he or she, that is offensive. Right, so it's very hard for me to navigate in there because there are languages that don't have genders, and it's like, how is that, like, it's not colonizing, it's Englishizing the world, right? So
I think you literally say exactly what you said, because that's like a very queer perspective, right? Is that, not all languages have gender terms for things, because students don't know that, right? Like, they just take for granted, right, that there's this kind of binary gendered system by which we refer to things as. And so saying, like, I speak this language where we didn't have to do this, and now, I have to try to assign these different genders, kind of destabilizes, why we have these labels to begin with. And that's kind of an inherent contradiction with queer theory, is that queer theory ultimately is trying to kind of like get rid of labels altogether for many of the reasons that you were just saying why they're not productive. But at the same time, for people, labels can be very affirming and a way to also like organize and find others who are like you. So there are those two different tensions there, between, in one case, referring to people in a way that's affirming, but then also reifying sometimes gendered ways of speaking. But I think just sharing that experience, right, to me is like, oh, you're thinking about that. And that's, students don't know that other languages don't take gender into consideration, right? I mean, they don't even realize that like they, them is now added to the dictionary as something that they can use in conversation in English, so. Yeah.
Just sort of like an experience related to the roll call thing.
Yeah.
I was in class on the first day. My professor started calling rolls, so basically announcing my dead name to the whole class.
Yeah.
I got on my computer and dropped the class immediately.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Like, it's a big deal for students. don't call roll the first day. Like, give them time to go up to you after class and say, hey, this is what my name looks like in the roll, change it to this, please.
Yep. And to also, I think like, this actually gets to the next point. Which is, I'm just putting on the reflection question, but the fact that this is often a systemic issue. So it's not even just one individual action. That individual action can matter, but it's not going to address all of these issues that led to your dead name being used in the first place. So of course, the instructor not doing roll call is one fix, but why is your dead name in Blackboard in the first place, right, is the larger question. And that's something that I also think queer pedagogy, and like if we're exercising that, we have to go beyond the classroom and start to question these like structural inequities that are produced by the technologies and the systems and the tools that we're using when we're teaching. But before we get there, just reflection questions, again, related to this topic. So thinking about like, what are some ways you can or already have performed queerness in the classroom? Because again, performing queerness is not just about coming out, right? That's not the limitation. So I would say that examples that you both gave are examples to me of performing queerness in the classroom, because you're challenging what students are taking for granted about things like identity and labels, and you're questioning the need for those things in the first place and why they're limited. And then how does recognizing some of these practices change how you look inwardly? Again, I put a lot of gender and sexuality, but it could be any identity that's positioned as not visible or outside of the norm. Okay, so I just want to do this quick, just some potential limitations with queer pedagogy. So the first one just goes back to that scope and why I told you what this wouldn't be about, which is that often folks can kind of reduce different strategies of queer pedagogy to like one singular action that they take, and they're like, solved it, check, done, right? And one of the problems in, for instance, just thinking about like representing queer experiences in your classroom is that often those tend to focus on trauma. And so right there, you're kind of like reinforcing this sort of narrative that it's always going to be a traumatic experience, when of course there's a lot of joy to being a queer person as well. There's a potential, of course, for these sorts of strategies to be labeled as controversial, again, especially in this socio-political moment. And so I think that like a potential strategy for counteracting this in your classes is kind of making the normal strange. So I always give the example, one of my like sub areas of research is drag story times. And so I interview drag performers and librarians who have hosted or not hosted drag story times. And I also look at media coverage of drag story times. And so especially over the summertime, there was a heightened interest, negative interest in drag story times by conservative news outlets. And they often pick up, this idea that like drag performers are exposing themselves to children because they wear tights. Are you scandalized by the Nutcracker, right? So again, thinking through actually taking the normal and making it strange sometimes when you might not necessarily not want to, but like, yeah, thinking about making the normal as strange as opposed to always just making hyper visible what people might consider or frame to be controversial. I think also there's this like limitation that when you're engaging in this sort of work, it's going to cause discomfort, right, in your classroom because it challenges traditional approaches to what we think is what knowledge is, and then like what's normal and how we should be acting in a classroom. And so I think that one of the questions that I have here is that queer theory would say, okay, if you make your students feel uncomfortable during classes, that's what you should be going for, right? Because they're starting to question things. But the problem, again, is that we're kind of in these institutional like systems and structures that punish that sort of an approach. So for instance, teaching evaluations. You engage in all of these different techniques, but then you get terrible teaching evaluations. That influences your ability to teach those classes in the future, right? And so there are definitely institutional and structural constraints with how we can exercise queer pedagogy. So maybe not a limitation of that, but a limitation of the current world in which we live. So I did want to end this with just a concluding thought. So this is actually an excerpt from an honors college thesis that I supervised, reprinted with permission from the student. And so she actually wrote a autoethnography about her social, legal, and medical transition. And one of the excerpts from her autoethnography actually had to do with Blackboard and dead naming and getting professors in the business school actually to recognize her pronouns. And so I just wanted to read this and really end with it, because I think the larger argument here is that we can't just reduce queer pedagogy to something that you individually do in a classroom. We also have to think about these larger institutions and structures and how they're set up to kind of limit or confine what we can do when engaging in these practices. So she says, step 1, update your school photo. You have no clue what the back end of the professor's system looks like, but you do know that a picture of you will pop up somewhere, and you must prevent at all costs your professor knowing the image of your past self, for even the thought of looking differently than what you look like now will spill your secret to the entire class. Step 2, realize that you can't change your name within the school system unless you have provided legal documents. You must accept that this is inevitable. Instead, you can give your preferred name. I know your preferred name is your real name, but you must realize that this world wasn't made for you, and that frustration must be let go. So change your preferred name in every school system you can think of. Step 3, send a flurry of emails to all your professors before the school year starts. Make sure that you traipse the line of desperate and self-advocacy. You must ask them for a favor, even though they are not doing a favor. Let go of your pride and get on knees for virtual groveling. This part is integral because you could be in a room where the majority of the class does not know you are trans, but the professor is the one who can reveal your secret, and you have no clue what they see when they look up your student profile. So you must assume the worst and plead for understanding. In this case, you have to let yourself be known in order to ensure safety. Step 4, debate saying your pronouns in the beginning of class. You know that no one else in the business school says theirs, and the professor will surely not advocate for this. So you either take the leap and let people assume, or you state them right away. It will be awkward, and it will make you feel like you are out of your body, but it has to be done. Step 5, talk as little as possible. Realize that your participation grade will most likely go down, but if you raise your hand as little as possible, then there's a less chance of being misgendered. Your professor doesn't have to refer to you in class if you don't speak, and if they don't have to refer to you, that means they don't even get the chance to mess up your pronouns. Step 6, get misgendered by 2 professors. Step 7, shake off the embarrassment. Step 8, continue your schoolwork. Step 9, wonder what you did wrong. Step 10, realize you did nothing wrong. So again, it's not just about pronouns, right? It's not just about these individual activities. It's about thinking about this more from a collective perspective. Because while getting the students' pronouns right is like really, really important, and part of the steps, there are several other social and structural factors at work here. There's the system, how do photos and names get displayed in Blackboard, law, and then also rules of technology. So you can't change your name in Blackboard unless you've legally gotten it changed. And then also class policies like participation, right? So we always think that the way to participate is to use your voice. There are plenty of students who don't want to use their voices in your class, and not just because of this sort of a fear, right? So in order to, I think, really achieve LGBTQIA plus visibility in our classrooms, we need to think through combating some of these structural factors and not just these individual things, even though they're really important. So just a quick recap. We're thinking about queer pedagogy as this consistent process of challenging normalcy. Again, you don't just see gender and sexuality on this slide anymore. There's no universal solutions to this. There's no best practices. That's because queer pedagogy is messy, right? And then it's also crucial to reflexively question our own praxis and the larger institutional and classroom environment in which we teach, because we need to think through how we and it inadvertently might produce cis and heteronormativity. So that's my time. Thank you so much for coming. And there is actually an evaluation link, so you can go ahead and do that. And I'm happy to take questions or chat, even though I know that we're